Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Levy-Faour, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to another webinar in the series on regulation and governance, or theories of regulation and governance. And we have a bi-series on intermediaries. Today, I have the pleasure to host Professor Eva Thomann on the issue of divergence, or explaining divergence of street-level intermediaries. And she brings in the accountability regime framework that she developed. Eva is a full professor of public administration at the Department of Politics and Public Administration at the University of Constance. I can say that this is one of the best departments of political science and public administration in Germany, well known. So is Eva. Eva is a star in public administration research. She's a good colleague of mine. I had the pleasure of working with her for almost 5 years, I think, or about 5 years, as the co-editor of Regulation and Governance. Eva is a public service person. She's, as you can see in the screen from both sides, her screen, she's involved in methodological training for young scholars, and she's a great colleague. So it's a pleasure to have her here. I would only say that she has a kind of a demanding task today. She's speaking about intermediaries and the accountability framework, on street-level bureaucrats, on the duty to report as a citizen's duty, but also she's using QCA, or set theoretic method. And all of this is coming into the paper and the presentation. So she has quite a challenge today. And I hope you will take as much as possible from this complex and demanding framework. So thank you, Eva, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, David, for hosting me, for the kind invitation. Also, you as a service person for, amongst many other things, convening these wonderful webinar series. And I'm very happy to be here today and to talk about my work on the accountability regimes framework. So I'm going to try and share my screen.
Going well?
Great.
Yeah.
So.
Excellent. Good start.
Thanks. Just try, yeah. All right. So today I will be talking about my work that this is the trend of research of mine that has really grown over many years. Starting in 2018 with a publication with Peter Hüppe and Fritz Sager, and then it was developed into something more explanatory. 2023 with James Maxia and Jörn Ege, and now culminating in a paper in the special issue that you have co-edited, David, in Policy and Society. And you can already see that I'm actually at the intersection of public policy and public admin, so basically a regulation scholar in that sense. And what happened here is that this perspective on public accountability that I will present today and on intermediaries has grown out of my interest in policy implementation and street-level bureaucracy. And then over time, I've developed this into something that we can use to study regulatory intermediaries as well. So it's kind of a marriage of these different subfields in which I'm also moving myself. So I will start by talking about the research gap that I'm trying to address here, which is the compliance of regulatory intermediaries, and I will focus specifically on street-level intermediaries. And then, somewhat maybe unconventionally, I will present my case, because it's an interesting case, and it helps understand and illustrate the theory that I will talk about. So the case is the prevent duty as it affects higher education in the United Kingdom. And theory is the accountability regimes framework, which was originally developed for studying street-level bureaucrats. And then I will present evidence from two related studies that I have conducted on these lectures in the UK, which is basically based on two data sets. One is a large and survey of social science lectures in the UK that was conducted in 2020. And then from that survey, we recruited participants for confidential qualitative interviews of those lecturers who had made real life experiences with the prevent duty. And so I'm going to present both qual and quant evidence, which are directly complementary and speak to each other. As I wanted to say, so if you have any questions and you want to jump in, you're very welcome to do that. So, what are we talking about here? You know, I really think that regulatory intermediary theory has been perhaps the major contribution to the study of regulatory governance in the last 10 years. It has really helped us understand the complex web of formal and informal relationships that characterizes the regulatory governance. And so these regulatory intermediaries, they are basically in between the regulator R and the regulatory target T, and they draw on their own capabilities and legitimacy to provide assistance to regulators and targets. And this assistance can take on many forms. I will get back to that soon. But I think at this stage, this is really a flourishing research agenda. There's quite some research on regulatory intermediaries, but my impression is that a lot of it is quite descriptive. So we're beginning to understand the diverse roles that these intermediaries have. We have a good picture by now of the different types of regulatory intermediation that we see, but what I see less is an attempt at explanatory theorizing to understand how intermediaries behave and how they perform. And I think what this nice, simple figure by Abbott et al. Already shows is that intermediaries are key in the chain of regulation. So basically what they do will directly influence whether regulation is delivered in practice and whether it works in practice. And usually they have some roles assigned by regulation. So that there's something that they have to do, they have to fulfill a task. And that also means that we need to understand why they decide to comply or not comply with the task. So basically, I suggest to really put the spotlight on this issue of the compliance of intermediaries. So if we acknowledge that there are usually also regulatory intermediaries in regulation, then we also have to acknowledge that what matters is not just target compliance, but also intermediary compliance.
Eva, can you give examples for intermediaries? Who are the intermediaries? Why they are important? I know that you are doing the duty to report or to prevent as an example, but can you extend it about who are the intermediaries more generally?
Yeah, so as I said, so they basically assist in regulatory tasks. So that this can be more formal or more informal. They might, advise regulators, or they might lobby on behalf of businesses toward regulators. It could be whistleblowers. Sometimes you have private sector actors that help in enforcing regulations. So, for example, we can see that I've studied them as food safety inspectors in some countries, so where private veterinarians help enforce food safety regulations on livestock farms. It could really be a wide range of different examples.
Yeah, I agree. I would just say that they can be auditors, certification, ranking, rating agencies, and they work between the regulator and the regulatee, or the rule maker and the rule taker.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the question that I will be talking about today, so I will approach this issue of intermediary compliance as a question of accountability. So I want to understand the ways in which intermediaries are basically answerable to different audiences, as we can again see here, so both to regulators, but also to the regulatory targets and potentially other audiences, and how that affects intermediaries compliance specifically during policy implementation. So a relational perspective and an accountability perspective on compliance. And so my spotlight will really be on the implementation phase in the regulatory process. And I think we've already discussed so that intermediaries could be active in other stages too, like in rulemaking or in evaluation, in monitoring, but I will focus on this implementation stage. Also because, you know, one key insight from implementation research is that any policy is always only as good as it's putting into practice, as its implementation. And that goes for regulation too. And therefore, if we want to understand compliance specifically, then implementation is kind of a crucial case to study that, because compliance is especially important there, as it is the necessary condition to make regulation happen. And I will zoom further in, even in the policy implementation stage, and look at what I call street-level intermediaries. So what that means is that I look at individuals. I don't look at organizations, even though they are, of course, embedded in organizations, who carry out tasks of regulatory intermediation at the street level. That means they have a direct interaction with targets. So let's say the food safety inspectors that I mentioned, they directly interact with livestock farmers. They inherently have discretion. So there's always, you know, in practice, rules need to be interpreted. And so there's always different ways in which rules can be interpreted in practice. So this, yeah. And they co-deliver regulatory tasks such as regulatory services or regulatory enforcement. And the way I approach the compliance question is that I prefer the term divergence. So compliance kind of means either you do what the rule tells you to do or you don't, right? But the term divergence is a bit more nuanced, in that what it means is that in practice, regulatory targets and regulatory intermediaries, they may behave in ways that do not exactly correspond to what the rule says. So that may or may not be non-compliant. But what it means is that the street-level intermediaries adapt and interpret these often ambiguous rules during implementation. This is usually their choice. It may be a rational choice, but sometimes it's not rational. It's ethical or you know, a professional choice. It's inevitable. A street-level divergence is the rule rather than the exception, because, as I said, rules usually have some degree of ambiguity. They usually have to act under time constraints, and then usually bounded rationality comes in. And this divergence can be transparent, but it can also be hidden, and they can do it more for themselves. Maybe, you know, because they're lazy or they have diverging interests from their principles. But it can also be other serving. So it might be, for example, to help livestock farmers better understand why food safety regulations are important and how they can well implement them on their farms. And so I just mentioned it already, but the perspective that I adopt is not a rational choice perspective. So I'm not going to apply principal agent theories to study regulatory intermediaries, not because I'm against them, but because I believe that especially when we look at policy implementation, there is usually strong bounded rationality where you know, decision problems have different degrees of tractability. People usually have cognitive limitations. They may have insufficient information, or they may fear some things, or they may have strong emotions, and they usually don't have that much time to take decisions. And so that means that sometimes solutions are satisfactory rather than optimal, so they may diverge rather than complying. I think we have a question from Rob. Hi, Rob.
Yeah. Rob, please come in.
You need
A
to,
very quick clarification.
yeah.
How, if at all, are you distinguishing street level intermediaries from street level bureaucrats?
So, street level bureaucrats, I think they often act as intermediaries, but not necessarily. So they are not, intermediaries are not the same thing as implementers always, right? They might, oftentimes an implementing task is really just a regulatory task. But in the examples that I look at, they are not actually state actors, so they are not bureaucrats. They work in the private sector, for example, at universities.
Thank you.
But actually, this is also an interesting question to discuss with David. To what extent, whenever there is implementation, there's always like, when do the roles of policy implementers overlap with those of intermediaries and when they don't? I'm also interested in that. Okay, so the case that I look at, just to make all of this a bit more concrete, is the prevent duty as it affects higher education in the UK. And those of you who know my CV know that I spent 3 years as a senior lecturer at the University of Exeter. And that's also when I bumped into this case because I had to implement this prevent duty myself. So the prevent duty is part of the UK's anti-terrorism strategy, which basically requires, amongst others, university lecturers, but also, for example, teachers at schools and actors in other public institutions to receive training about the prevent duty and then to basically act as whistleblowers. So in their daily work with students, they have to identify whether a student is at risk of radicalization, and if so, they have to report them to the Home Office. And the interesting thing here is that the way the prevent duty is spelled out, the lecturers should not do their own risk assessment. They're provided with some like criteria or scenarios that would indicate reporting, but the actual assessment of the risk and then taking further steps is the task of the regulator, in this case, the Home Office. And it affects a wide range of university activities, also, for example, inviting speakers to campus, but I'm going to focus on this reporting duty.
I would say, if I'm allowed,
yeah.
That it's very similar to the situation in money laundering. So you probably know from the literature or from crime movies that banks and other financial agents have to report suspicious behavior. So they have to fill up a report, and gradually now they have to do risk assessment, not in this case of the prevent duty in higher education. So this is another example. So the case that Eva is studying here has general implication well beyond the British or the higher education case. Another example is the example of the duty to report suspicious migrant status in the UK. So here again, if you are renting a house, you have to check the credential of the renter, and the government is here doing civil or private agents proxy of the state.
Exactly. So basically, this policy responsibilizes university lecturers, right? So they become responsible for preventing radicalization, but it's not part of the professional profile, right? Which we know because we are all lecturers. And also, it's not really possible to enforce their compliance. So it's very difficult to know whether they have complied with the reporting duty unless the student really ends up doing something radical, right? And it seems, I think from the regulator perspective, it seems like a good idea, right? So, who is closer to the targets than those lecturers? So they're obviously in a unique position to actually identify these students. And I think that's one of the motivations for engaging regulatory intermediaries, right? That they can do the task better than the regulator sometimes. And also because they have the specialized knowledge, that they're in the field. But also, of course, it is cost effective, right? And so let's look at this regulatory arrangement a bit closer. So we've got the regulator or rule maker, that's essentially here the Home Office, which has its counterterrorism policing channel program. And the tasks of the regulator include risk assessment and, where appropriate, applying de-radicalization measures. And overall, they have the responsibility for preventing radicalization. And then we have the targets, which are the students, whose main duty, if you will, is to abstain from extremist speech and action. And the policy also kind of requires or assumes that they trust the lectures, so that there's a relationship of trust between them. And then in between are the universities. And so that the universities as organizations are obligated to provide training on the prevent duty to their staff. And then usually at the department level, or it could be at faculty level, that there's a so-called prevent duty lead. That's someone who is kind of the point of contact for this kind of stuff, and who would, for example, pass on the information to the Home Office. Sometimes these are just heads of departments. Sometimes it's just someone at the department, and sometimes there's a specialized role for that. And then you've got the lecturers, whose job is to detect and report the at-risk individuals. And so you can see this important role of the lecturers because, the Home Office kind of delegates the task of identifying at-risk individuals to them, and then they have to refer back, and they are kind of the link in the chain, because they're the ones who interact with the students, so they have to monitor the students, and the students interact with them. So what do you say, David, is a classical intermediation setting?
Yes, I'm not sure. Well, we gave few examples, and they see more and more of those examples, like the mandatory reporting of child abuse, or the rising expectation not to stay outside, not to be silent, to speak out when there is abuse or corruption or
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of a reporting setting. So that's one of the possible intermediary tasks. It's a mandated task, so they have to do it. So they're obligated by law. All right, which is not always the case. It's not voluntary. Well, if we approach it from a policy implementation perspective, we can say it's a case of symbolic implementation. So it's characterized by very high levels of conflict, political conflict. So a lot of people think that this is a highly racist policy. So it's very disputed. It's a polarizing policy. And it's also very ambiguous, because it's notoriously difficult to define what means radicalization and to identify it in practice. And while the Home Office has put a lot of effort in crafting these training materials, I have looked at those materials and I don't find, they didn't make it that much clear to me. So the ambiguity is there. So what that means is, according to Matland, what we mean here, what we should see here is that what ultimately decides the success of implementation is really down to the actors on the ground. So it basically depends on what these intermediaries choose to do or not. If we look at it from an intermediation perspective, it's a case of what we would call interpretive mediation. So the task has been officially delegated to the lecturers, to the intermediaries. There's a piece of regulation where it's written down, but at the same time, the content of the task, it's not fully unformalized. But again, so there's this inherent ambiguity. It's very difficult to regulate it in much detail. And overall, so there's little explicit guidance on how to execute this. And so what I would argue is that this makes this a likely case for non-compliance or divergence, just because of this ambiguity, because it's very little to monitor these, it's very difficult to monitor these intermediaries, and it is so conflictuous. Okay, and now I'm sorry that I'm actually already showing you my empirics, but just because I want to give you a feel of what this actually means or why this is important empirically. So what you see here is a figure from the survey that we did with social science lecturers in the UK. So the N is a bit more than 800. And we presented them with a vignette that is, according to the Home Office's training materials, a clear case that must be referred to the Home Office under the prevent duty. And here's what these lecturers indicated that they would do. So a bit more than 20% said they would actually refer the students. So that's 1/5 that would say they comply. But then there's also a lot of them, they could indicate more than one of these options. That, for example, said, I'd rather chat with my colleagues about this. Or they say, no, I'm going to talk with the students. I'm just going to figure this out with the student themselves. And there were also other things that they could do, or they could also indicate that I'm not doing anything. And so what we can see is that quite a lot of the times, the lecturers do not just literally comply with this policy, and they may have good reasons for that, right? But the question is, why do they do that? And now, again, sorry for anticipating the results, but then I looked at, I talked to lecturers who really have made a real life experience with the prevent duty. And here are some cases that they actually reported to the Home Office. So this is kind of non-divergence or compliance, right? If it's correctly reported. So students were advocating for more police discretion to act against Islamist threats. Students took a gun to the university campus. That's a clear-cut one. The first one is not very clear-cut, I would say. Student harboring radical right-wing views and engaging in inappropriate online activity. Classic case. Email request for PhD supervision from a university associated with Islamist mosque. Student undertaking problematic research topics and wanting to read Islamist writings. Okay, now here are the cases that they explicitly said happened and they chose not to report them. Students wanted to watch videos of beheadings and also advocated female genital mutilation. And so just for context, watching videos of beheadings on a university computer is a criminal offense in the UK, unless you have a special authorization. So there were 2 of such cases that were not reported. Students did an in-class presentation that contained a lot of swastikas. A female Muslim student was at risk of forced marriage. And another student that expressed right-wing views. Okay, so I'm not sure how about you, but I don't see a clear-cut difference between the 2. So if anything, actually, the cases that were not reported are slightly, to me, more concerning than the ones that were. I mean, it's a bit a matter of judgment, but clearly there is something going on here that is not in the written policy. And that's what I'm trying to understand with this research. So I approach this question from an accountability perspective. So what is accountability? It's answerability toward others that have a legitimate claim to demand account, right? So it's relational in the sense that there's an actor who is accountable to others. It's often retrospective, but not always. There must be some consequence attached to it. So you know, you're answerable to someone, and you kind of expect that depending on what you do, there's maybe a tangible consequence, a sanction, but it could also be, you know, a reputational loss, or that you disappointed them, or so. But there's some consequence, and it's public, so it's somehow about the public domain. So in the case of the prevent duty, we have the lecturers who are, like, if we just look at the formal accountability, right, to the regulator, so they are accountable to the Home Office, to the regulator, about reporting students who display certain behaviors. Through what processes they notice the PD officer, but then how the process exactly unfolds is regulated a bit differently depending on the department, but usually the PD officer would then escalate to the Home Office. By what standards? The PD guidelines, but again, so there's no oversight or enforcement. Usually it's not really possible to directly enforce this regulation on lecturers. And related to that, there are a few effects. Unless an incident happens, usually there's no consequence for the lecturers, depending on whether or not they choose to report. But I don't know how you feel about this, but my feeling is that these lecturers are not only accountable to the Home Office. There's more going on here. And with the accountability regimes framework, we propose to adopt a less formal and more informal relational perspective on accountability based on role identity theory. So the idea is that these street level intermediaries have multiple different roles. They have multiple hats that they're wearing. I'll show you in a minute. And therefore, there are also multiple and maybe contradictory demands on them, for example, from the regulators, but then also from their fellow lecturers, from the society, for instance, from the students. And then, you know, there are also market pressures. The universities have to generate income, right? And then there's also the democratic society. So they may or may not, for example, disagree with this policy politically and feel that it's something they can reconcile with their own values. And so it's a bit more complicated. Now, from this perspective, accountability is a social relationship which can be more or less formal, in which street-level intermediaries feel an obligation to explain and justify their conduct to some significant other, not in a romantic sense, but in the sense of someone they think is important to them in some sense. And then there's a bit of vocabulary, basically. On the one hand, we can identify so-called accountability regimes, which are defined as sets of guidelines for action for street-level intermediaries that prevail within these different roles and relationships. So basically, there are, you know, explanations and justifications to be given for certain actions. I will illustrate it in the prevent duty case in a second. And then within each accountability regime, we have so-called action prescriptions. So basically norms and demands about how the street level intermediaries should preferably behave. For example, that they should preferably report, or maybe the students would like them to preferably not report them and things like that. And these can come from the institutional level, but also from the organizational level or at the individual level. So it's a very multi-leveled setting. And then from taken together, all these different expectations, they kind of mount up to what's called accountability pressure on these intermediaries. So the accountability pressure is really the expectations that they need to meet. So let's illustrate this in the case of the prevent duty. We have different accountability regimes which are associated to roles from intermediaries. For example, the public administrative regime, they have to be the whistleblowers, and they're accountable to the Home Office or the state, maybe to law enforcement at organizational level, and then at individual levels to their managers, or also it could be police officers. But they're also professionals, so they're educators, they're lecturers, and so there are professional norms that they want to account for, you know, educational norms, stuff also like academic freedom. And so they talk a lot with their peers. They know that, they share understandings of what is a good way of doing their job, for instance. And then at the participatory or societal level, they have a pastoral role toward the students. So the targets here are the students. And then we also, in this 2023 article, we added a political ideological regime, which means that these intermediaries also, they are political animals. So they are members of a democratic society. And as such, again, they feel expectations from the democracy, maybe from political organizations or networks, or from their fellow citizens on what an appropriate behavior is or not. So if we look at the action prescriptions system from this, so we call the public administrative pressure, we call it rule pressure, so formal rules like the prevent duty. And then from the professional regime, professional norms. From the societal regime, like, for example, the needs of the students and what the students expect from the lectures. And then political and ideological principles. And accountability is ensured via different mechanisms depending on the regime, right? So, for example, there could be formal or legal accountability within an organization, but there are, peer review, peer expectations that is a mechanism of ensuring accountability. Then there are exchanges and meetings with clients, and maybe also, for example, student evaluations or other forms of student feedback. And, there could be political considerations, discussions with friends or with party members and so on that ensure political ideological accountability. So that's just a way of kind of mapping these different multiple roles and relationships and resulting accountabilities. So just descriptive so far. And now what we argue with the accountability regimes framework is that first, the street level intermediaries will attribute different degrees of importance to these different accountability regimes that we call norm reference. So it's the intensity with which street level intermediaries will allocate their attention to and maybe also identify with particular action prescriptions or pressures. So maybe a given lecturer finds it less important to report to the home office and more important to make students happy, for instance, right? And we focus then on accountability dilemmas, which are situations when multiple action prescriptions create competing demands and values. So maybe some action prescriptions, conflict with others or are incongruent with each other. And what we basically assume is that when multiple accountabilities coexist, which is often the case in hybrid settings, and simultaneously, street level intermediaries attribute high importance to some accountability pressures that are not the rule pressure, then it becomes more likely that we see dilemmas, and that in turn, as soon as there are accountability dilemmas, it becomes more likely that they will diverge from the formal rules. So that's quite a simple sort of approach, and we don't expect that it's only the accountabilities, but we argue that accountabilities play an important role to explain divergence. Right. And yes, David, you're right. I need to speed up. So we can basically summarize this. Whoops. What I'm showing you here is examples of such dilemmas. So for example, having to apply the prevent duty may cause a lecturer to compromise on their standards of educating students and defending academic freedom. So that would be an example of the rule professional dilemma, right? Or they if they refer a student from a minority background who is not truly radicalized, then that would be unfair. That's a rule societal dilemma, right? Or they may fear that enforcing the prevent duty gives universities undue power in policing thought and language, right? So it makes me a nation of the state. That's a rule political dilemma. And so these three propositions are basically the the formalization of what I just mentioned. And that's basically what I'm testing in this research. And so now let me turn to the evidence already. Finally. So what we did is, as I mentioned, we crafted a vignette that provided the lecturers with a situation that, according to the training materials, would clearly have to be referred. And we recruited participants for the survey by web scraping the contacts of all social science and humanity lecturers in the UK. And so we sent them an invitation for the survey. We got about 830 responses, which I think, considering that it was 2020 and the pandemic, is quite nice. And in that survey, we also asked them whether they want to do an interview with us in case they had an actual experience, real life, with the prevent duty. And so we had 35 follow-up interviews, of which 19 were usable because the others were cases where, well, they basically just wanted to rant a bit when we excluded those. Right. And then, so the situation was, so you have a conversation with a student and they tell you, oh, I've been browsing a website of this group that's known for its approval of the use of violence or illegal means. And then the student expresses sympathy with the philosophy of the group and the, you know, what it promotes, and talks about having to get involved in the cause. And that's like a clear-cut case for the prevent duty. And then we asked them in the survey how willing they would be to implement this policy. And we also asked them how likely they are, having evaluated this scenario, to actually report the student. So that's basically the compliance, right? Or the divergence. So what we see in the results is that the street-level intermediaries most strongly refer to the professional and societal and political pressure. So they attribute quite little importance to implementing this prevent duty. So the reference to rule pressure is very low. And also to not very much to market pressure. So even though the universities have to generate income, they're not concerned about that too much. And this is also reflected in the dilemmas, in the accountability dilemmas that they experience. So they think that the prevent duty might cause them to compromise on their standards of educating students. That's the rule professional. It's almost 48%. Or providing equal treatment, mentoring, and pastoral care to students. That's almost 50%. And also that they have to compromise on their political and ideological principles and values. That's 40%. So it's a contested policy. And it creates accountability dilemmas for the lecturers. And accordingly, only 15% of them are actually indicate to be willing to implement the policy. And only about 50% would actually indicate that they would actually report them as required. And we then tested in this policy studies journal study different hypotheses, and we find empirical support for this hypothesis that as they refer more strongly to accountability regimes other than those of the regulator, that they're then also more likely to experience accountability dilemmas. And as they are more likely to experience accountability dilemmas, they're also more likely to diverge. So we find some support for these notions of this, the ARF. We also tested an interaction effect. So we assumed that basically the lecturers with political views that contrast the prevent duty are more likely to articulate that they experience a rule political dilemma. Unsurprisingly, we find that, but this is not moderated by the reference to political ideological accountability. So it does not matter how important they find it to comply with the rules. So basically, we find evidence that this accountability regimes framework is useful to explain divergence. And now, and that basically the street level intermediaries correct, so they use this implementation kind of as a means to correct for the rules that they perceive to stand at odds with their duties as political citizens or their own ideological and political beliefs. So it's political, right? Now, then, and that's maybe the most interesting thing, how much time have I left? Yes, that's great. Is I also looked at these real life cases, and I think I'm really happy and grateful that I was able to talk to these people confidentially. So I can't tell you too much about who these lecturers are, right? And then I analyzed these 19 interviews using crisp set qualitative comparative analysis and case studies. And the nice thing, because the data were coupled with the broader survey, I was able to test the robustness of my small n comparative results, whether they can also travel to the broader sample of UK lectures. So it's kind of a nested design combining QCA with this experimental setting, which I think has never been done before. So for this study, again, the outcome is compliance. So whether or not they correctly reported or also correctly decided not to report, so that's also compliance. And then I look at whether they received formal training, how strongly they refer to the rule pressure, and then whether they experience one of those dilemmas, so rule professional, rule societal, or rule political. And the general expectations is that if they are well informed because they have received training, if they find it really important to comply with the policy, or if they have no accountability dilemmas, then they will comply. Whereas if they don't attribute importance to complying with the rules, if they experience several, 2 or 3 accountability dilemmas, if they have not been formally trained, so that they're insufficiently informed about the policy, then they will not comply. And I mean, the short story is the results are fully in line with these expectations, but it manifests in different ways. So for compliance, we find, for example, that what I would call the well-trained and unconflicted intermediaries, they comply. So they don't have an issue with implementing this rule, and they have received good training, so they know what it's about and they agree with it. So they just see it as a natural and necessary part of being a professional. And then there are those that are simply completely conflict-free. So they say, well, prevent hasn't changed how I work, and you know, you act to keep people safe, basically. And then there are the cases where compliance basically trumps politics. So even though they actually feel that this prevent duty clashes with their political values, they have been well trained and they find it important to comply. And so they report even though they actually disagree with the policy, which I find quite remarkable. So training can, to a degree, overrule this reluctance because of other attitudes toward the policy. So, for example, this lecturer thought it's a fundamentally flawed policy and it's also unfair against Muslims, but they also find it unavoidable to notify because, you know, it's about risk prevention, and whether I like it or not, it's part of my job and it's always on my mind, right? Now, more interestingly, what are the results for non-compliance? Well, we find that the untrained, politicized professionals did not comply. So these people feel that, well, first of all, they feel insufficiently informed about the policy, which we also see in our survey, by the way, that a majority of the universities don't explicitly train lecturers on this, or maybe only, you know, a set of slides to send around or something like this. And then they just feel uneasy about it because they feel that it's potentially biased, for instance, and and they are just not sure if they can reconcile this with their role as lecturers. And then there are the so-called unpolitical but conflicted educators and mentors. So they don't have a political issue with the policy, but they worry that the prevent duty turns students into suspects and undermines the relationship of trust with the students. And they also see a tension, for example, with academic freedom and the university's duty to protect that. And so they decide not to report, even if illegal behavior like watching these beheading videos is involved. And then there are the politicized non-compliers. That's the only one case, by the way. So this is just someone who really has strong political issues with the policy, does not care about complying, says themselves, I'm not someone who tends to stick with the rules, and so basically the rebels. So we can see that these accountability dilemmas play out in different ways. So there's what we would call equifinality, but they're all in line with these expectations, and they confirm that there's quite some explanatory value for the ARF. So I was able to explain 17, I think, out of the 19 cases. So that's an almost full explanatory power. And yeah, so I then tried to replicate these results by testing whether I can, whether they also hold in the bigger data set, in the survey data set of 800 plus lectures. And what you can see here is basically that, and that's really interesting, the explanations for non-compliance exist in the same way in the larger data set. So they're generalizable to this representative data set of the underlying population. Whereas the results for compliance cannot be replicated. So in the large N data set, they don't pass the thresholds for consistency and coverage and so on. With one exception, which is this well-trained, so what was it called? The compliance trumps politics. Compliance trumps politics also, and we also find that in the bigger data set. But when we then look at the results that we do find in the bigger data set, then they are also substantively quite in line with what we find in the smaller data set, but they cannot be reproduced identically. But so that would mean, I would argue, that this ARF has quite a high capacity to explain why the street level intermediaries diverge. But it also shows that we can train the intermediaries, and that the training really improves their understanding, awareness, and acceptance of the regulation, and reduces the compliance barriers. Another strong finding is that the lecturers actually take over the task of the regulator of risk assessment. So it's almost a form of capture, in the sense that they sort of disempower the regulator, and instead of just reporting cases that conform with the scenarios, they assess with themselves whether they see a risk or not. And what we have seen is that this assessment is often quite flawed, right? So it's not objectively clear, whether there's no objective clear difference between cases reported and those not reported, because, you know, they just respond to all these different considerations when they make these assessments. So when we delegate these regulatory tasks to intermediaries in these hybrid settings, there's a risk of accountability dilemmas, which means, I think, for regulators, it would mean that it makes sense to kind of, before you decide to delegate tasks to the intermediary, try to analyze what are the different accountability regimes in this field, are there potential accountability dilemmas, and how could we, you know, how could we mitigate these dilemmas in order to improve compliance? And so that's my last slide, and I took a bit longer, sorry, but I would basically argue that there are several limitations, right? So the case is, as I said, is quite a special case. And so future research should look into whether the ARF has also explanatory value in other cases, other types of intermediary settings that are maybe not such strong, not such likely cases for divergence, right? Can we adjust this framework to also explain the compliance at the level of organizations? Of course, what other factors play in, right? It's not all about accountability for sure. And then, of course, the crucial question, how can we design effective intermediation studies? And I hope I've made a modest contribution. Thank you for your patience in listening to me.
Thank you so much, Eva. And let's take questions. If you have some, I took the liberty to answer to Corey questions in the chat. She asked about do institutions or organization can be intermediaries, and I said yes. And I see Rob is asking a question, so please go on, Rob.
Thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating talk. I've got so many thoughts going on around my head, so I'll try not to take up the whole half hour. But if I start just with my own personal experience to lead into actual questions, when this policy first came in, my thought was, well, A, what am I looking for? And B, how can my actions be monitored? And one of the things, I've got one or two questions, one or 2 points you've said that I just want to challenge you on. I mean, you made a comment that you can't really know what's happening with an individual student unless an action happens. So let's say there's a terrorist incident. It doesn't matter what kind of terrorism committed by whom. And in one point you write, unless an incident happens. But even if an incident happens, how can that then be traced back to the lecturers? There's a presumption there that the action is based on prior thought that was also expressed to lecturers, was also expressed and not reported. So, I mean, there's a fundamental question there, I think, even if a student does commit a terrorist act, that the meaning of the entire policy seems to me to be flawed. And I've got a question on that in a second. The other question I want to just challenge you on is right at the end, you said that lecturers make informal risk assessments that are flawed. I would question the word flawed because simply because the entire policy is ambiguous. So whose risk assessment isn't flawed? So I would just question those words, those words you used. So to questions very, very quickly. Certainly in the UK, there's a big thing in the Office for Students about free speech at universities. So what are the challenges that prevent offers vis-a-vis the free speech policy? You interviewed over 800 people. Sorry, you had over 800 survey responses. Did you record how many of those had actually experienced issues firsthand? And how do you think it would play out if you were to survey all subjects, given the question of how likely it is that a student would discuss with their lecturers, say on a, I don't know, on a course on architecture or archaeology. Social sciences and humanities, these things might come up more often, but even within that cohort, how many of your 800 plus survey respondents had actually experienced these issues. And then my final question, it kind of like sums up absolutely everything. Is there an issue here? And it comes back to the accountability question as well. Fundamentally, I think, is there, are we also talking in the literature about the well-known gap between policy and design, as design and policy is implemented? Because it's all very well designing a policy where you expect the academics to act as intermediaries, but on what basis are they deemed appropriate in the first place? We might be closer to students than government ministers, but that doesn't necessarily put us closer to the kind of conversations that they might be having with friends, with peer groups, and so on. But
what is the question here again, the last one?
So it's, do you think there's a fundamental issue here in terms, because there are huge issues around the implementation policy, but do you think the problem of policy implementation is actually fundamentally underpinned by a flaw in the basic policy design?
Yeah. Thank you so much. Can
Eva,
I?
Yes, I wanted to ask you to respond because we have limited time.
Yes. Thanks so much, Rob, for your input. And I think you're asking the right questions. I mean, So no, you are right that even if a student engaged in a whatever terrorist incidents or so, that doesn't necessarily mean that it can always be tracked whether or not a lecturer complied with prevent duty, right? But I would argue that if nothing happens, then nobody will ever know, right? If something happens, then, often there are like paper trails of, I don't know. I mean, in Exeter, we had to document every tutor meeting that we had and stuff, right? So it might be possible if the police comes in and investigates that they realize, okay, there was something going on, but it was never reported. It just makes it's kind of a necessary condition. But as you rightly point out, not sufficient. Are the risk assessment flawed? Actually, I think what you said yourself kind of, in a way, reaffirms that I chose the right wording, because you rightly asked, well, whose risk assessment isn't flawed, right? So, I mean, it's just all flawed, right? But the reason why I chose this term, which may be because I'm a German speaker and but the reason why I chose it is, it's this slide that showed you in the beginning with these examples of cases that were reported and those that were not reported, which simply does not show a clear qualitative distinction between what is deemed as a risk and not. If anything, actually, the cases that were not reported were slightly more graver cases than those that were reported. So that's what I mean. I'm not implying that the lectures are somewhat, stupid. That's not what I mean. But I, as a lecturer myself, I can say I feel blatantly unqualified to take such a consequential decision, right? And I'm not good at doing this risk assessment. So I've not been trained, right? And I think the results reflect that it's not a task that the lecturers should be performing, that they're performing in a way that can be objectively seen as effective. But then the question is, of course, is there a fundamental design flaw? So I think so. The research that I've performed here clearly suggests that there is a fundamental design flaw, the way the prevent duty is designed right now, for the reasons that I've just presented, right? How can it be done better? I think it's more difficult because, as you say, if let's say if the home office trained social workers that are present on each campus and that kind of assess students, screen students, whatever, they might also come up with flawed judgment. I mean, in the prevent duty training materials, someone attending a mosque regularly is already an indication of possible radicalization. I mean, so I think this is just a policy that is inherently, it's the radicalization concept as such that is just inherently not possible to define in a way that is not controversial. And in that sense, yes, it's inherently flawed. I don't know if this is a satisfactory answer, but I guess this is an example of a policy that's very difficult to design well. And I mean, David, I think, because you're studying also anti-money laundering, and so I guess it's probably not unique to the prevent duty, that it's just really difficult to design it well, right?
Absolutely. Fabulous. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. The example, let me put myself in the I started to study the issue with I didn't publish yet, but I started to study the issue on child abuse, and it's a process of decades until the norm of reporting abuse became established. It was a kind of public norm, became a public norm, but also there was an issue with the professional community. People like physicians, social workers, psychologists, teachers in school, and how to make them report, to whom. Is it effective? Reporting is just one process of in saving the child. And what are the conflicts in reporting between the interest, the benefit for the child, for example, and the normative expectation to report and to punish the abusive parents, or the teacher or kindergarten nursery staff and so on. So it's a huge issue of normative changes around reporting.
And I should have put that also in my slides. I think also the trust in the regulator plays a role. And I think there should be more research on this, because, I mean, in the case of the prevent duty, a lot of the lecturers really don't trust the Home Office. Some of them are migrants themselves, and the hostile environment is really doing its thing, right?
Yeah.
And so they don't trust the Home Office to handle it well.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. We did experimental study on this issue on reporting child abuse, and then also on reporting waste management or waste, throwing waste in public spaces. And these are two papers. One of the papers is already under review. So I'm all in favor of this line of research. I would say that in the child abuse case, the basic issue is voluntary versus mandatory reporting. So should we do it mandatory and then punish, or should it be voluntary system of reporting? And this is the debate which going on many, many years. There are very few cases of prosecution. I guess also with the duty to report in the case of terrorist activities or things like this.
Yeah. By the way, Rob, you wanted to know how many real life encounters there were, and I think I should.
I have an alarm here.
Okay.
I don't know if you hear it.
Anyway, so Rob, let's catch up bilaterally, and let's. I mean, we already are over time, right?
Yeah, 12 minutes after time.
Sorry.
Sure.
No, it's all. Thank you so much.
Let's catch up bilaterally.
Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you so much, Eva. Continue to do the excellent work that you do. Enjoy the rest of your day. And
you too.
Thank you so much of being here.
Be
Bye.
safe.
Thank you. Bye.